Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this live meetup session today. This is one of a series that we are just starting for Hack to the Future. Hack to the Future is our global FinTech hackathon that just launched and is aimed to redefine finance for good. And for more information about it, please check fintech.devpost.com. Today, our focus is on the European regulation framework that fintechs need to navigate and comply with. And for this session, I'm really excited to have with us today Solenne Niedercorn-Desouches. Solenne is an independent advisor and non-exec director. She's also the host of the FinScale podcast, which is definitely one of my favorite fintech and innovation podcasts that I invite you to go and check. So, Solenne, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you, Sherin. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Can you please tell us a bit more about you and your background, what brought you to the fintech space?
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm glad to be here today with you to talk about fintech and regulation and how to struggle with it and to manage it and all the challenges linked with the constraints. So my name is Solenne Niedercorn. I'm based in Luxembourg. I've been working in the finance industry for quite a while. It all started in France. I worked for HSBC as a sales side financial analyst. Then Dexia, now it's been acquired by Candriam in the hedge fund industry. And then I moved to Belgium and I started working in the private banking activity at UBS as a portfolio manager, investment consultant and project manager. And then I moved to Luxembourg to join the small team entitled to open the Luxembourg office of Lombard Odier. And then I've been in charge of developing the external asset manager desk in Europe and then in charge of the business management. And then the second part of my professional life is more entrepreneurial. I launched a marketplace for secondhand sales in Luxembourg called My Braderie. And then I was hired as a product manager in a RegTech company. So I've been working on several launch of activities, launch of registration of funds, launch of a credit institution, launch of electronic money institutions, etc. And since November last year, I advise a startup willing to launch regulated businesses in the finance industry. And I am also independent board member in regulated companies.
Wow, that's really impressive. Now I know that for today you've prepared lots of content for our audience about the EU regulation, lots of tips and recommendations on how to best deal with them. So I'll hand it over to you to take us through that.
Yes, and do we have a Q&A session at the end?
Yeah, absolutely. So we invite all of our audience to post their questions directly on YouTube and LinkedIn via the chat. And we'll be happy to take them at the end.
Okay, perfect. So let's start. My wish today is that at the end of this masterclass, you realize what it means to launch a regulated entity, and you realize what it means to start working with a fintech company as a regulated entity. I promise it's not going to be boring. There are three main areas I would like to explore today with you. Is first to have a sort of helicopter view of the regulatory landscape in the finance industry. Then second part, I would like to show you how to start building a regulated entity when you're 4, you know nothing, and you want to touch the sky in the coming months. And then last but not least, how to efficiently work with a fintech should you need to outsource some key activities. So as you know, to launch a successful startup, we have different key success factors. You need a strong and skilled team. You need a great idea. You need a perfect execution, a good timing, good market timing, of course, growth and funding. There is one success factor that is missing and is crucial for the fintech. It's the regulator. So today we will talk about this, also regulation. So for this, I'm sorry, but we need to go back to the fundamentals and go back to the basics. So it's crucial for you to have these elements in mind before we really start to analyze the two use cases. So our focus today is Europe. So we will not talk about the US, we will not talk about Asia, it's really Europe. So if we go back to basics, there are in Europe 3 European supervisory authorities. So we have the ESMA, European Securities and Markets Authority, the European Banking Authority, and the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority. So what is the mission of these 3 ESAs? It's first to coordinate their supervisory activities in the scope of their different responsibilities regularly and closely, then to ensure consistency in their practice, and to exchange with what we call the ESRB, the European Systemic Risk Board. The board of this, the mission of this board is to oversee the financial system of the EU and to prevent and mitigate systemic risk. So this is the basic of the authorities. Then at EU level, there are different rules. First, you have the regulations. So regulations are binding legislative acts. They must be implemented in full throughout the European Union. There is one regulation that you potentially know because you use it, you use tools in that sense. It's the electronic identification and trust services for electronic transactions, meaning every time you sign electronically, this is in the scope of this regulation. Then you have a directive. A directive is a legislative act that sets targets for all EU countries. However, each country is free to develop its own measure to achieve them. One of these famous directives is the Payment Service Directive. Then we have recommendation. It's non-binding and allowing European institutions to make their views known and to suggest a course of action without obliging the addresses to comply with them. Then we have the decisions, binding on the addresses to whom they are addressed and directly applicable. Then we have ITS and RTS. ITS, it's implementing technical standards, and RTS, regulatory technical standards. So these are standards that are given to the different member states for the implementation of certain directives. And then we have the guidelines, which allow the institutions to express an opinion in a non-binding way. In other words, without imposing a legal obligation on the addresses. So what happened at each member state level? So at each member state level, there is a responsibility of each member state to transpose those directives into their own rules, certain binding legal acts require uniform conditions for implementation, but at each member state, they need to transpose them into their local law. And there are some differences across the different regulators. It's important to have this in mind. So it's a bit heavy. The European regulation, I'm sorry to say that, it's heavy. We have to face this, but it's important to have a good overview of what it means. So I have listed in the following slide what are the main rules, main directives, regulation to have in mind with regard to the finance industry. So the idea is not today to go in each of these and to understand all of these, to understand how it's working, but it's just to give you a big picture. So there is one regulation, one directive, one regulation, one area that concerns all of the actors. So credit institutions, payment institutions, electronic money institutions, funds, etc. It's everything that relates to financial crime, anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. So that concerns all those actors. But some of these concern just a few of them. So if we take the example of UCITS, it's undertakings for the collective investment in transferable securities, or the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive that concerns mainly the fund industry. Payment Service Directive concerns account information service provider, payment institution, payment initiation service providers, so actors related to the payment area. So it's important to understand that regulation has been developed and is made, to give some rules in a very complex sectors. And we had a good example of a big fail this year. It's Wirecard. So Wirecard is a company that has been established in Germany, and Wirecard, there were many actors using the services of Wirecard. So there is a huge systemic risk within the finance industry, and this is the reason why the regulators and the supervisory authorities really build strong rules to avoid this as much as possible, because there are huge risk and cascade that is potentially happening in that whole sector. So there is a magic passport that enables regulated entities to settle in one country and to sell its products and services in other member states. So this is what we call the EU passporting. So there are two possibilities. Either you inform the regulator that you will open a new branch in a specific country, and this is what we call the freedom of establishment. So it's a very simple notification file. It just takes just a few weeks to be able to open the branch. Or you just mention the regulator, so there you don't need any specific authorization. You just need to inform the regulator that you will potentially propose your products and services in a certain number of countries. You just mention those countries, and then you're able to go and distribute your products into those countries. So you see, it seems quite simple. But why different layers of regulation despite EU harmonization? So we talk about EU harmonization, we talk about all those directives that are transposed at EU level, and then we realize that it's not so simple. Why? Because each country has also its own rules. So you need to have in mind that you have all that layer, that European layer of regulation, directive, decision, etc. And then locally, you have also some rules that are very specific to each country. So this is why I have put this image of United Colors of Benetton, just for you to remind that there are some specific rules to bear in mind. Two examples. With mortgages, mortgage is very different in France versus the other countries. And another example can be the savings regulation. If we take the example of employee savings plan, in France, the framework is la loi Pacte and le plan épargne retraite, the PER, the PER, and it's very complicated for a company offering those services out of France to sell those products across Europe, because there is no real European vision and a European directive around this. So this is important that you have this in mind. First, there is the EU regulation, those European supervisory authorities, those three I mentioned, they are building a framework, a regulation framework, but there are local habits and rules to keep in mind. And one element to keep in mind is that the devil is in the detail. So I'm sorry I have to do this long introduction about this framework, because it's important for the rest of this masterclass. So we will go through two different cases. First case, a startup which needs to potentially become regulated. And second use case, a financial institution which needs to outsource part of its activity to a fintech company. So first thing, if you are a startup, you want to launch a business in the fintech, what you need to do is first an assessment. So an assessment means define your parameter. Define your parameter means that first you need to clarify your differentiating value proposition and your business models. Second thing, you need to spot all your competitors and understand the way they are organized. Define who are your target clients. Will you sell your products to retail clients or to institutional clients or both of them? Then have a clear definition of the services, meaning that you really need to define, even if you want to do a freemium or if you have 3 different pricing in mind. It's important to have a very granular view of the services. Interesting also to identify partnerships with regulated institutions. This is what we call the license as a service or banking as a service. Then have a high-level definition of the products and at minima a macro product roadmap. Then, of course, have in mind your high-level processes. So if you're targeting to become an investment firm, at least your onboarding process, your investment process. So how will you organize yourself? So really try to also define, roughly how you want to be organized in that sense. Of course, analyze the home-based country. So if you don't really know in which country you want to settle, analyze the different options according to your different target clients, and analyze, the different specificities, as I said, the local rules of each of those countries. Infrastructure is either you want to be cloud-based or on-prem, and then very, very important, the external providers. So should you need to incorporate external providers such as identification systems, signature system, try to at least have a rough analysis, an assessment of all of these. And I will not go into the details, but it's important to already identify at least those providers and understand the way they are organized. So why should you clarify this? So the parameter is very important because as soon you will see that when you will have to meet your regulator, they will challenge you on all of these points. So it has to be crystal clear in your mind. Now that the parameter is designed, then you need to go very deep in the analysis of your regulatory environment. So what's your current regulatory framework? What does it mean? I mean, how does it impact your strategy in terms of responsibilities, substance, reporting, governance, audit, capital requirements, even recruitment, training, and of course, your P&L. Then, what's your regulatory strategy? What are the different options? And we will see this at the end of this presentation. You might choose different options. There is not only one single way to perform your service. You might do it gradually. And how does it fit the regulatory constraints? I mean, how or the option can be designed to also fit the regulatory constraints. So you can sometimes take some shortcuts and have a strategy in different steps and be completely aligned with the regulation. Then, how is your regulator organized? Meaning, how does the application file process work? What's the process in place with the regulator? Can you contact them directly? So even very pragmatic questions you might have. And how long does the process take? So usually you get all this information with exchange with competitors and people who've been through all the process once at least. Then, last but not least, one element, check the setup of your competitors. How did they evolve? What is the setup they have put in place? So all this information is public. You can really gather that information very easily on the website of first the competitors, the general terms and conditions, the website of the regulator. You get all this information publicly. And then last but not least, is your product or your service new from a regulatory perspective? Because you can potentially launch a new product, a very interesting one with artificial intelligence, but it's never been done in the past. So this also needs to be assessed. So now that you have answered all these questions, you might need to receive the holy grade, a license. But then you need to be prepared, and you need to go through this application file process, which is a bit heavy. What you need to do as soon as you know that you need to go through this process is to prepare, to warm up. And you need an A team. So this is the A team you need, because a filing process can take a year, 12 months, or sometimes more. It's usually a document that is between, I would say, 100 pages for heavy application files, with more or less 50 appendices, where you get all the financials, detailed business plan, governance, organization, description of the main department, your AML CTF policy, outsourcing policy, etc., etc., etc. And should you outsource also in the cloud your infrastructure, then you need a specific authorization from the regulator. It's cloud computing outsourcing filing, which will include business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, exit strategy, IT security, internal policy. So you see, it's a bit heavy, so you need to build your A team. What you need to do also is, once you have your A team, is to plan your filing process really as a project and with a real task force. Second thing, it's important to request advice from specialists to have a global overview of your constraints according to your options and, as I said, your regulatory strategy. Then you need to adapt, of course, your business plan in consequence, and particularly the funding and the timing. Important also is to liaise with your shareholders and your board member and communicate on the strategy, the process, and the potential delays. It's important also to be very crystal clear with the board members, because not all of them have been through the process, and sometimes they could challenge you because they're not prepared for such delays, and sometimes it can last a long time. Then read. It's important that you read yourself as a CEO, as a CEO, CTO, the directives, the regulation, decrees, laws, everything that concerns your area of competence. But it's important to have all those elements in mind. And last but not least, take this process seriously. And it really represents for you a great opportunity to extend your knowledge in regulation, and really, from the beginning, have in mind all the constraints that it will bring to your activity. So now that you've done the warm-up, then you execute the filing process. So you have to bear in mind that it can be really a heavy process. As I said, it can last 12 months, and you have hundreds, not hundreds, but dozens of appendices. But as I said, and we will discuss this afterwards, you might have different options. So this filing process to become regulated can be light. To be honest, it can be light if you choose the light option, or if you can, your regulation environment is not so important. That can happen, of course, but it can also be hard. You don't necessarily need to go through a full-fledged license, and you can start as a neobank, for instance. You can start with the license of another bank and gather and get your license in 1 or 2 years afterwards. What is important to bear in mind is that you are, as a startup, if you're a startupper, you're in a rabbit mode. Clearly, you want to go fast, and you use, to have a lot of reactivity from your teams, your partners, blah, blah, blah. But the regulator is in a turtle mode. So rabbit versus turtle, it's important to also have this in mind. Another element, and I said it previously, is that it's painful, to be honest, but it's really structuring, and it really helps you to structure and build a strong entity able to really fulfill the constraints and to be able to face sometimes very specific situations. It's a multidisciplinary approach requiring really different competences: compliance, risk, finance, business. So it's important, again, to build a strong A team. And last point, interesting also to see it as a sanity check of your future activity, meaning that you will have to challenge the way you want to organize your company, the way you want to build processes, your IT security. So you see, it's also a good opportunity to also challenge the way you are organized, or the way you would like to be organized. So what are the do's and don'ts? In this application process, what are the do's and don'ts is, first, what you need to do is to meet your regulator. You go and see and sit, if it's possible, or you do a WebEx with your regulator. But it's important to do it when you are ready. So meaning that you have already answered all your questions, you know your perimeter really by heart. It's important because the regulator will never give you any answer to your question. Of course, there are some regulators that are open-minded and willing to support the business, and more regulators are like this, but they will never answer you any questions. So if you arrive with a new product, a new idea that doesn't really fit the regulatory environment, you can come to the regulator and discuss, but you really need to have in mind a strategy. You have to know by heart the different constraints, and it's important that you also show, it's a question also of perception. You need to show to the regulator that you are organized, and you have done a very deep and thorough analysis of this element. Second point in the do's is to be very precise, and particularly the 4I principle. You need to have the document read by different persons with different eyes, because it's important, if you want to be sharp and efficient, to go through the process deeply once, instead of having back and forth discussions with the regulator. Then be proactive and reactive, meaning that if the regulator comes back to you with some questions, don't take 2 months to react, but rather 2-3 weeks. Of course, be humble and honest. Be irreproachable and know your subject. It's so important. It's really important to show to the regulator that you have understood the constraints, that you understand the challenges, and that you take it very seriously. And of course, in the don'ts, don't lie, don't improvise. So don't lie, meaning if you have a problem struggling with a shareholder which is not keen on signing a comfort letter, just simply inform the regulator that it takes a little bit more time, but don't lie, don't hide the reality. And of course, request some support from specialists, and don't delegate the entire filing process. It's so structuring that it's important that all the founding team and the people, the authorized manager or future authorized manager, are really in the process, looking at the engine and see what's going on. Okay, so now you've done the process. It took 12 months. You had, 3-5 exchanges with the regulator, and then you received your license. Congratulations. So now you're authorized. So it's just the beginning, I would say. Once you're authorized, it's huge. It's really heavy. So of course, as I said, you have light licenses, and you don't necessarily need to go and have from the beginning a full-fledged credit institution license. But anyway, the process remains more complex than your life is a bit more complex than before. So it means more complex means that you are an entity now with rules. You need to follow the directives that you have built, and like the AML/CTF or the outsourcing policy. You need also to build processes with regard to onboarding, business continuity, SLA monitoring. You need to perform reporting to your regulator. You need to follow your solvency ratio. You need to perform some audits. You need also to monitor your governance, meaning that you need to have minutes for your general assembly, your board, your executive committee. You need to monitor your providers, your best execution. So I will not go into the details of all those elements, but to show you that we are now in another world. So what you need to do is, if you want to be efficient, is to set pragmatic processes tailored to your entity with the principle of proportionality. If possible, build your own tools as much as you can, so it can evolve with your company. Then you need to log all your to-dos in sort of project management tool and define a project plan. So what you've described to the regulator in your application file is actually your strategy, your plan in terms of organization. So it's important that you transform all those elements into a project plan with the to-dos when you're authorized, because as soon as a regulator is coming 1 year after your opening, you need to have built everything that you said that you would build. Of course, you need to define some controls. And as I said, yes, remain aligned with what you have explained to your regulator. And clearly define the roles, who is doing what, and particularly for the internal controls. Okay, so now it's important to be smart with regulation. It's important to bear in mind that your company doesn't necessarily need to start with a huge, complex, and very expensive framework. So you can, and this is the beauty of the FinTech, you can build services using licenses and services of other FinTech players. This is what we call banking as a service, license as a service, payment as a service, etc. So it's important to analyze those options according to your business model, as I said, and have a strategy in mind. It's important to, of course, consider the local rules of your target countries. And when I said that it's important to build a strategy, it's important also to have in mind, at least not to plan, but have in mind the impact on your company. So if you start with a very light setup and you want to grow in 5 years or 3 years with a huge credit institution license, then you need to figure out what it means in terms of resources, impact of P&L, because it will also impact your funding, etc. And then you need to, yes, as I said, you need to define your recruitment needs according to each phase. So also log when you meet people with high potential and very well-skilled, I mean, write their name on a paper and keep it in mind for your next steps, because it's important, again, to have an A team and, a team that is really, really executing perfectly if you don't want to lose time and if you want to be efficient. Last element I wanted to mention is to think one step ahead. Think one step ahead and think out of the box. What do I mean by this is that, as I said, so you need to prepare the next steps should you target a new type of license. Important, build a smart regulatory watch. So you need also to liaise with your local ecosystem and see what's going on, and if things are moving in a certain way to hear what's going on. And also important to subscribe on your local regulator. They have newsletters, so it's important to be very reactive with this regulatory watch. Of course, meet regularly your peers, your competitors. Exchange with your auditors. We forget that sometimes the auditors can really be of great support, so it's important to liaise with them internally or externally and exchange with them to see how things could be improved. Exchange with the community, with your local ecosystem, and last but not least, and it's important right now, is to build your own ESG charter. So I guess now you have a better knowledge of what it means for a fintech player to be regulated. Keep cool, because you don't necessarily need to follow all those steps and to bear a license, but it's important to raise all those questions quite early in the process to at least realize what are the main constraints that you'll have on your business and potentially could really slow down the launch of a product, for instance. So now it's important to analyze also from the bank perspective or the financial institution perspective, which is building a solution with a fintech player. So here again, I will try to show you some steps to follow and some recommendation to ensure that you comply with the rules. So let's face reality. It's not always love crush. Working with a fintech player as a financial institution is sometimes a bit complicated. On one side, we have risk-averse actors, so the financial institutions versus fintech players eager to take risk. We have different momentum. Bank and insurance companies don't have the same momentum as fintech players. It's rather months than days. Of course, we have on one side incumbent players with their legacy, and on the other side, new players testing new markets. Then for some players, innovation is part of the DNA. For fintech players, it's part of the DNA, but for incumbent players, banks or insurance companies, this is clearly not part of it. So it can be sometimes a culture clash, yes, and the processes are not the same. You have a strongly processed company versus a very agile and pragmatic fintech. So yes, we all know this, and I think I don't. You're already aware of all those elements. So what should you do? Keep it simple, but be realistic and don't be naive. So what do you mean? What do I mean? Sorry for this. About this, to be efficient, once you've agreed on the POC and it's working perfectly and you're happy and you want to move forward, you need to perform a short, but it's important to perform a quality assessment to avoid buy surprises. Of course, not the full-fledged heavy assessment that your procurement is usually doing for, I would say, something like a core banking system, but at least check legal elements, GDPR on one side, non-personal data, and on the other, personal data, DRP, BCP, outsourcing, financials, IT security. This is, I would say, the minimum. Then, of course, you involve your procurement, your chief information security officer, your data protection officer early in the process, so they will not block the fintech afterwards. Then it's important to draft light contracts. And it's interesting because on my podcast, I had interviewed Laurent Charon, who is head of innovation at AG2R La Mondiale, which is an insurance company. And this is the first thing he told me, that they managed to work with that startup because they had very early in the process drafted a light contract. So you can have a light contract with a light SLA, but light, not the 100 pages contract that you usually have with your procurement. When I said don't be naive, of course, build an exit strategy, so a plan B. Because as you know, many startups fail, so it's important to see what's going on if they fail and that you don't have the service anymore. Of course, you need to set some measurable KPIs and implement controls at minima. And this is the most important thing, perform a regulatory assessment. So it's important to categorize whether or not the service that is provided by the fintech player is an outsourcing first. And so if it's an outsourcing, if it's a material outsourcing or a non-material outsourcing. And should it be material, then you need a specific authorization from your regulator. So I make the distinction between notification and authorization. Notification, it means that you just send a letter to your regulator as a financial institution to inform that you will work with that fintech player in that context. Authorization is when you are outsourcing. You're outsourcing a material activity to a player, to a new provider, then you are in a real subcontractor environment, outsourcing environment, and this process implies a filing. So of course, it's not as huge as I described previously, but it's important to bear in mind also as a fintech player that your clients, which could potentially be a financial institution, could have to go through also a filing on their side. This is what we call in France PSEE, Prestation de Services Essentiels Externalisés, and we do have the same in also other countries. And it's interesting to have in mind that, for instance, the European Banking Authority has defined guidelines on outsourcing arrangements. So if you want to comply with the rules, you have to define in your contracts all those arrangements and set all those arrangements, such as, for instance, the audit rights, which are, I would say, the minimum that you need to have in your contracts. So it's important for you as a financial institution, when you go through the process for the filing process, to liaise with the fintech player to prepare your file. It's important to set a file that is aligned with the context. And I would say to consider this process as a joint effort between, on one side, you as a financial institution, and on the other side, the fintech provider, and then set a small task force liaising with the fintech. So I know I've given you a lot of information. I will share with you some checklist afterwards if you want. I think that what we have quickly understood today is that being regulated is not a piece of cake. It requires a real implication. So as a fintech, what you absolutely need to do is first to understand your environment and deeply understand it, then to build a regulatory strategic plan with various options. So choose a strategic country, grow step by step, start without a license and build a partnership, for instance, with a payment institution. So this is what I mean by a strategic plan, regulatory strategic plan. Then build a team with people having strong knowledge in that field and people who have been already through the process. That would really, really help you. Of course, and I'm sorry for that, but it's important that you read also on your side the directive, laws, decrees, to have a good understanding of all this environment. And then important also to keep in mind is also to perform a regulatory watch that could potentially impact your business. And as a financial institution, I would I would highlight 3 elements. First, of course, assess your fintech partner. Be realistic, but also pragmatic. And in case of outsourcing, never underestimate the timing and inform your regulator ASAP. So I have been, it's 11:43 in Luxembourg, so I will leave some time for the questions. Shirin, can you? Yes, you're back.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Solenne. That was very informative. I really liked the session. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our audience as well. My key takeaways here are that it's not easy. It's really complicated, but it's definitely structuring, and it can be a competitive advantage also for a fintech to fill for certain regulations. So that's something to definitely be considered as you launch or grow your fintech. Mm-hmm. We've actually got a couple of questions from our audience, the usual ones asking whether the session is recorded. It is, and you can actually find it on the same links under YouTube and LinkedIn. The other question we've got is about the slides, actually the notes, if you'll be sharing them.
So what I will share, because it's a very, very long presentation, I will just select some slides and make some, I will share with you, Shirin, and maybe you can publish them, the main important elements that I would keep in mind, the must-dos, I guess, which are the most important.
Perfect. Thank you. That's great. We've got another question actually that is specific to the AML, anti-money laundering.
Where is it? I don't see it.
Actually, just asking about more details. It's a question from Raul Sultan, and he's asking about more details about the AML regulation.
Okay, so AML regulation concerns very different areas. So when you onboard, for instance, a client, you need to ensure that this client is not a personally exposed person, that this person is not blacklisted. So you need to make some checks at the onboarding. You also need to, when you work with companies, with legal entities, you also need to check the directors. So if the directors of this company are not PEP and are not blacklisted, you also need to check the beneficial owners of those companies, and to ensure that they are not blacklisted and PEPs. It's important also to bear in mind that it's a continuous check. So as soon as you onboard clients, you need to ensure that those clients, if they become, criminal, then you report them correctly to the CTF, your local CTF. And also, there is, it's related mainly to the anti-money laundering rules and counterterrorism financing. So when you start fintech business, it's important to, this is why I said in the beginning, you need to define your perimeter. So define also the type of clients you are selling your products to, and build an onboarding that is able to catch all the client at risk, and ensure that you have a process in place to that you report them to your criminal the entity checking this for your country. And then you follow the rules that are given by your local regulator. I don't know if it answered the question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Solenne. Another question that I had for you is actually about other geographies and other regulations out there. We've been very much focused on the European regulation today. Mm-hmm. Maybe share with us a bit more about regulations of other countries, maybe taking the example of the US, and what would be the main differences?
Okay, so yes, what I described today is mainly, yes, of course, the European regulation, because this is the one I know. Of course, it's very different across the globe. And in the US, to give you an example, for GDPR, we have GDPR in Europe. It's quite easy. But in the US, it's state by state. So for instance, in California, they have designed an equivalent of the GDPR, but it concerns only California. So you don't have the same constraints if you're in Utah or Nevada. This is one example. Another example is that if you want to launch a business in the US and you're based in Europe, then you need to go through a file for state by state. You don't have one I would say, license that goes for all the US. It's not like in Europe, where we are very lucky because we have this passporting, as I said, it giving you the possibility to sell your products across Europe. In the US, you need to go state by state. So it's a quite heavy process, and I would say that Europe is quite in advance with regard to finance regulation compared to the US. It's quite interesting. For instance, blockchain. In the blockchain area, the US are still struggling with ICOs, and in Europe we are a bit far in that sense. So it's interesting to see, and it's important. This is why it's important to also build a regulatory watch process to ensure that you also grab new opportunities in Europe and potentially also in the US. But the US, it's a bit more complex, I would say. Asia, I'm sorry, I don't have a great view on Asia.
No, thank you. That's very interesting. One other question that I have for you, I don't see any more questions from the audience, so I'll go with my own questions. One other question that I had for you, Solenne, is actually as one of our judges for the hackathon, I wanted to ask you, and you will be judging specifically on the FinTech category. What would make a winning FinTech in this competition? What are you expecting to see there?
So for me, I will show you my slide, which is one of the most important one. It's this one. Can you share my screen? Yeah. So this is the team, the A team. It's important to build a strong team, of course, but in the FinTech area, the strength also is in the competences and diversity of competences, and to ensure that at least you have one person at C-level owning the regulatory elements and having in mind all the constraints, because it can really slow down the process and can be really a problem if you don't have those competences and you don't realize how strategic also it can be. So this is the first thing I would say, the team. Of course, the execution, but it's a bit complicated during a hackathon to assess this. But the capacity to, I would say, have a strategy. I would say a regulatory strategy to see if you cannot take from the beginning shortcuts to have something that is easy to implement, to test, to be able to test easily your market. And then to have that strategy in mind, meaning that you build like a Lego. You start with something that is small, and then you grow, and you have your regulatory environment, which is more complex. But you design it. It's important to I don't know if it's clear, if I'm sufficiently clear, but it's important to have that strategy in mind. And of course, the idea. It's important, to have something that is quite innovative. So I'm really excited to be part of that jury.
Cool, thank you. And we're also excited and looking forward to see all the innovations and all the fintechs that will be part of the of this hackathon competition. Solenne, thank you so much. This was so insightful. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our audience as well. The regulatory framework is indeed quite complex. It can be a bit overwhelming, but I'm sure with the tips and recommendations that you've shared, these are actually very helpful for all of our audience and for the ones that would like to get started and to grow in the fintech space. Yes, and yeah, everyone. Oh yeah, sorry.
If you want to stay in touch with me, you just need to scan the QR code, and then you just send me a LinkedIn. I would be more than happy to help.
Yeah, thank you. And also feel free to post any other questions or comments on LinkedIn or in YouTube. We'd be happy to take them with Solenne. Now, before closing the session, I just wanted to mention our next live meetup, which is planned for next Tuesday, 17th of November. We'll be hosting it jointly with EFMA and Capgemini, and we will focus there on bank and fintech collaboration, another angle to it this time. And we'll be actually looking at a special, we'll have a specific focus on sustainable platform. Thanks a lot, Solenne, again, for being our guest today. Thank you, everyone, and see you there.
Bye.
Bye.